Chapter 8 Prisoner of the Sioux. Lisha watched the Indians drive stout stakes into the ground on both sides of the big anthill. He saw them uncoil the rawhide thongs. He knew what the scene before him meant, but he seemed to be detached. The ropes, the stakes, they could mean but one thing and relate to but one person, himself. Yet he gazed as one in a dream. Even when they stripped off his clothing, he made himself as one who does not care, who sees death spread before him and defies it. They tied his naked body over the anthill, all the time watching him and grunting to themselves in a satisfied way. Lishu resolved that he would give them no cause for triumph. He knew well the Indians' respect for bravery, and his nature went along with the Indians. He could not cry out, or moan, or struggle. He would not beg for mercy, or behave in any way different from the most heroic of their braves under similar circumstances. As soon as his body touched the anthill, the ants swarmed over him. Their crawling and biting annoyed him, but the most pain came from his wounded shoulder. Would it get infected? His lips curled deliberately into a sardonic smile. The Indians, watching, grunting, and looked at one another. Lisha faced reality. It couldn't matter whether his shoulder got infected or not. Nothing mattered anymore. He had never heard of any victim of the Sioux surviving this anthill torture. When the heat of the day lessened and he knew that evening drew on, thirst began to plague him. He felt sure that he would not suffer long. The ants had now penetrated every body orifice and every inch of his skin. Their stinging mandibles chewed with constant vigor. Lish's thirst increased and became almost unbearable, yet it must be bore. He tried to move, but his least effort stimulated the hordes of ants to more intensive activity. His mind reeled. He did not doubt the madness that madness threatened. The day faded, the darkness fell. The Indians left him, and he heard their footsteps and voices fade into the night. He looked up at the stars, brilliant in the sky, and he wondered about God. He had heard Eliot discuss the works of Ingersoll and Paine. He himself had been so agitated over the doctrine of everlasting hellfire that he had determined never to worship a God cruel and unreasonable enough to torture human beings forever and ever. In spite of these things, he had never made up his mind about God. He had never got a Bible as he promised himself that day when he drove away from the bird tail swing station. The pain in his wounded shoulder and the fervorous ants kept him in constant torment. He looked at the moon and stars and recalled the Bible story his mother had taught him, especially the one about the three Hebrew children in the fiery furnace. Could that story be true? Could it be possibly true? A strange thrill shook him. Suppose it had really happened. Would God be any different now from what he had been thousands of years ago? Lisha faced the truth. No one but God could deliver him. He must fix his hope on God, who created the stars and the moon, who must have power to do anything. But what could he say to God? Why should God care about him, a man who had gone his own way? who had rebelled against God, who had not one good thing to recommend him. The story of the prodigal son flashed into his mind. He decided that he would do just what that foolish and wicked young man had done. He would tell God the story of his life and ask him for forgiveness. Racked with torment, tottering on the brink of madness, he recited his story and asked God for forgiveness and peace. He lapsed into unconsciousness. Did he taste cool water? It seemed to him that someone held a dipper of water to his lips and that he drank, but he could not be sure. He knew only that he felt refreshed. Everything swam in a murky haze, and he saw the sun peeping over the horizon. Its first rays fell on his chilled body, and they felt good and comforting, although he was still bound to the stakes and stretched across the ant hill. A surprising thing had happened. The pain had gone from his shoulder. Even the ant bites didn't bother him. He heard footsteps approach. He knew that the Indians had come from the village. He knew that they expected to find a madman. He smiled at them as if enjoying a joke with them. More Indians came. Alicia had not realized that so many Indians lived in that little cluster of lodges. Everyone in the camp must be there. Even the chief, who had condemned Alicia to torture, stood there looking down at his helpless prisoner. Alicia wondered what they would do next. He had no more fear, only deep peace. The chief came over and began to untie Alicia's hands. He sat up at once and felt it a relief to straighten his back. He saw that some of the Indians objected to what the chief had done. One old buck, with a savage leer on his face, picked up some dirt and rubbed it between his fingers and his thumb. Dirt! Dirt! He spat out the words with venomous spite. You are nothing but dirt. Then he turned to the other Indians and spoke to them in the Sioux language. Alicia could not understand what he said, but the faces about him grew more menacing. While they continued to argue, Alicia reached out and untied his feet. Then he sprang up and spoke in a loud voice. You call me white dirt. You say white men kill all Indians. When did white men torture Indian as you have done to me? You are brave when you are many, and I am only one and wounded. Alicia could see that the Indians listened. Some of you have come to my village, and we have fed you and treated you kindly. I come here, and you starve and torture me. Your hearts are no good. The chief stepped between Alicia and the Indians. No say more talk. Indian heart black today. He held out his hand. You come. The chief led him back to the village, with all the other Indians following in a lodge with a couple of guards. They gave him water and buffalo meat. Although the meat had not been salted, Alicia ate it with relish. The sun beat down on the lodge and it grew warm. Alicia felt so sleepy that he lay down on the floor. He wakened to find that darkness had fallen. Fresh water and food stood beside him. He ate again and refreshed himself with the cool water. Then he moved about the lodge to exercise his joints, still a little stiff from his exposure on the anthill. Alicia talked with his guards in a friendly way about hunting and fishing. They could speak more English than he had supposed. They gave him a breechclout, such as they wore. The days went by, and the chief permitted Alicia to walk about the village, but he could not leave the circle of teepees. The Indian boys made constant sport of him when he appeared outside his lodge. They spat at him and threw dirt. To this behavior Lisha paid no attention. Before many weeks passed, the Indians moved their camp. On the first morning there, the chief came and told Lisha, "You go find wood with squaw. You no stay in camp, lazy. You no try run away. We kill you." Lisha knew that nothing could be more insulting from an Indian buck than to be compelled to do squaw's work, but he welcomed the chance to get out of the stinking teepee and into the woodland or the prairie. Cottonwood, ash, and willow grew along the streams and fed the Yellowstone. On one of these streams they had set up their new camp. On the bluffs, dwarf pine and fir flourished. Lisha had always loved the open prairie and the woods. He worked hard, gathering great bundles of wood. The squaws approved of this arrangement. They could speak nothing but Sioux, had learned no English at all. They kept to themselves and spoke in their own tongue. Lisha found them a jolly lot of fat women who joked and laughed when the men were not around. They had a sense of humor and often played tricks on one another. They had their own particular wisdom of the woods and grasslands, which Lisha grew to respect. One day as they worked, a little Indian girl screamed in sudden anguish. A rattlesnake had struck her leg. The squaws killed the snake and quickly gathered wild herbs, while they applied which they applied as a poultice to the snake bite. Lisha wondered what would happen. Should any white child suffer such a bite, she would be dead in a short time. The herb poultice seemed to work. The child quieted. Within a few days, the little one was playing as though nothing had happened. Lisha thought back often to his night on the ant-hill and his prayer to God. He did not doubt that God had heard and delivered him. The matter of everlasting hellfire still puzzled him. He reasoned that if God is so tender and merciful to one poor man caught in the Indian torture, how could he possibly torment millions of men and women in hell? The whole nature of God had taken on a new meaning. He began to hope that he might find some way to escape and return to his family and friends at Bozeman. Everything Lisha looked on had taken on a new significance. Nature became a revelation of God. He saw God's love in the infinite variety of his creation. He had made things good and beautiful for men. Lisha began to learn the Sioux language. The squaws delighted to teach him new words. When he could carry on a broken conversation with them, they acted much pleased. Once, just as the whole wood-gathering party seemed to return to camp, Lisha sneaked into the brush, hoping that they would not see him. Might not even miss him until morning, but the squaws had sharp eyes. They called him to come back, and with a heavy heart he went along. One morning the bucks took Lisha along on a buffalo hunt. He rode along with the 24 braves and felt glad. Maybe now he would be allowed to join in their hunts, but he soon found that they wanted him to do squaw's work again. He must skin the buffalo and cut up the meat. Their hunt led them along the bank of the Musselshell River, and they discovered a small band of river crows camped across the stream. Lisha knew that the Sioux and the Crow had been friendly for generations. Only since the white man's push west had crowded them had they had trouble. He wondered what they would do now. The Crows mustered for battle with tremendous noise and activity. They plunged their horses into the river and swam across, shooting and howling. They charged the Sioux at full gallop. The Sioux wavered for a moment and then fled with the Crows in ferocious pursuit. They went only a short distance and then wheeled about and turned on their enemies. The Crows fled before them back to the river. These wild changes and countercharges continued until the Sioux finally withdrew. Lisha estimated that perhaps 1,000 shots had been exchanged, the only casualty, one dead horse. More weeks passed, and Lisha failed to win the friendship of the Indians. Most of them never relinquished their hatred. Nevertheless, the Indians decided to adopt him into their tribe. None of the Indians had whiskers. They always plucked out the few hairs that grew on their faces. Now they held Lisha down while a squaw with a strong pair of tweezers pulled out all of his beard. Although they had adopted him, they never fully trusted him. They did not leave him alone at night, but always bound his wrists and ankles. His skin became callous, and the fetters did not annoy him any more. Lisha knew that in spite of their show of friendship, he could expect no safety among the Sioux. One day, while he dressed a buffalo and strung the meat up to dry in the sun, a bullet whizzed by, barely missing his head. He knew that he must escape soon or be killed by the Indians.